Hi folks, Photo Fisher here. I'm going to show you today in this video how to make one of my favorite and most productive topwater popper patterns, the Blockhead Balsa. Super easy to make using just a square balsa dowel rod. The materials that you'll need are a square balsa rod. In this case it's 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and this happens to be a 36-inch piece. It's a little shorter than that now since I've made a few poppers off of it. You'll need a ruler, an emery board, a hobby saw with a very fine kerf to it. Here's a coping blade saw with a bit of a thicker kerf to it, so we'll cut the hook groove with that instead of the really fine-toothed hobby saw. Popsicle stick, I'll show you what that's used for in a second. And I use a cutting guide. Don't need to use one of these, but I use a cutting guide to help me cut nice square cuts and edges on the Blockhead Balsa. And the hook I like to use is a wide gape stinger hook. It's a Daiichi 2720. It's also the same as the Mustad 37-187 size 6, whereas the Daiichi is a size 1/0. This is what we're going to end up making before we do all the finishing work. Notice I just cut a hook slot that's nice and nicely sized, and the hook fits in there just perfectly nice and snug. The most common size of Blockhead Balsa that I make uses a 3/4 inch body. Here I've placed a mark at 3/4 of an inch where I'd like to make my first initial cut. Using the hobby saw, cut the first popper segment. To cut the top angle of the popper body, I use a popsicle stick to kind of wedge in there to create an angle like this. The next cuts we'll make are the beveled sides. I usually try to leave 1/3 of the width here, 1/3 and 1/3. And I bevel it from the top point of the top of the popper body down to the back. I cut these by hand. It's much easier than using a jig. The next step is to sand it all smooth, and then we'll put the hook groove on the bottom. The next step is to cut a hook groove into the bottom flat side of the popper body using a thicker curved coping saw blade. You don't have to go too deep, just enough to put the hook shank inside of the hook groove. The key thing is to have this cut perpendicular with the front popper face. If it's at an angle, it will pop at an angle, which isn't a bad thing. But if you want it to pop true straight back towards you as you retrieve your fly, you want this to be perpendicular. Alternatively to a flat popper face, we can add a cupped popper face. Here I've got a 5/8 inch metal burr mounted in a drill press. You have to be careful when you do this, but I prefer to manage the wood going into the burr versus the burr going into the wood. I hold on firmly and I let the burr do its work. I've applied some tying thread to the hook shank to help adhere it to the popper body. Just apply a bit of super glue, not much. And press the whole thing together. I like to leave a little bit of the hook shank exposed between the hook eye and the popper body. This allows the epoxy finish to settle in behind the hook eye and not in the hook eye itself. It's important to get the hook perpendicularly aligned with the bottom of the popper body itself. After the hook is secure inside the hook slot on your popper body, the next step is to harden the wood and prepare it for painting. I do that by dipping it in some Minwax wood hardener. And I'll place it on a piece of paper towel. As you can see, I've prepared several of these bodies in advance, and I'll dip each one of them and harden it. It'll take about a half hour for this to dry. To speed the drying process, I'll place a small battery operated fan and set it on the low setting, just to move air across the top. Now that the popper body has been sealed and hardened, it's time to sand the bottom flat, basically sanding that hardened super glue. And if there are any recessed areas along the hook slot or in the wood itself, you can apply some wood filler. You really don't need too much. I spread it out using a stir stick. And it's okay if you make it lumpy. We'll sand that flat one more time. We're just trying to get the hook slot filled. Now that the body is hardened, sealed, filled, and sanded, the next step is to put on some Hardhead Pearlescent Green by Loon Outdoors. It's a pearlescent base coat. I apply 3 coats to each body. After each coat is applied, I hang it on my drying rack to dry before applying the next coat. Now we begin the painting process. I paint the bottom of the popper first using Rainey's water-based foam popper paint. You can use any white paint that you want. I just happen to have some of this available. You may have to apply 1 or 2 extra coats to get it completely white, depending upon the paint that you use. Now it's time to paint the bodies. The colors I prefer are chrome orange, Spanish olive, and acid yellow. The first color I'll apply is the acid yellow, and I'll put it on the lower side of each side of the popper. The next color to be applied is the Spanish olive, and will cover the top half of each side and the top itself. Let's start with the top. And you can see I have it pretty thick, such that it has a really dark olive color. And then on the top half of each side, I'll do the same thing, blending it into the yellow. Might be tough to see on the video here, but I do have a nice blending from the yellow to the olive on the sides. And the last color I will apply is chrome orange on the flat front face. This you can apply as dense or as light as you'd like. Once I've painted all the popper bodies, I hang them on my homemade bead chain dryer to let them air dry for a couple hours. Now that the Copic airbrush colors are dry, it's time to put our spots and dots on the popper body. I just use standard fingernail polish. We'll make it pretty simple on this pattern. We'll just use black, white, and a sparkling green, which I've used in other videos. I've got some homemade eye dot stamps of various sized brass rods and little plastic rods that I'll use to make my spots. And I'll come back with a smaller rod and make some smaller black dots in here. We'll let that dry and then we'll put on the next color. Now that the black is dry, I'll place a smaller dot of my sparkling green color on top of some of the black dots. The next step is to paint a white circle on top of the black larger circle for the eye. This is part of a 3-step eye process. Notice I off-center it. So I'm making the eye appear as though it's going to look downward. The last step in making the popper eyes is to put a black dot on top of the white dot, which is on top of the black dot. And again, I'll off-center it to create an eye that looks something like that. Now that the paint job is complete and dry, it's time to sign your work of art. Sign each one with a permanent archival ink marker and let it dry. Now it's time to put on a final protective coat. I like to use Flex Coat's Lure Epoxy Gel Coat system. It's a highly durable and flexible and temperature tolerant epoxy specifically made for lure making. I've pre-measured equal parts of the hardener and of the resin. And now I'll add in some copper red flakes, which comes in the kit. I really like the copper red flakes in contrast to the olive paint job on these popper bodies. When you mix the epoxy, it will first turn cloudy, then it will turn clear. That's when you know it's properly mixed. Don't worry about air bubbles. Those will settle out during the spinning and drying process. Next step then is to apply a thin coat of the epoxy mix with the glitter in it. And when it's all done, just place it on this turning wheel for curing. Once you've applied the epoxy to the popper bodies and you've placed them on the spinning wheel, wait 24 hours and they'll be hard and cured and ready to tie for the final step. Now that the popper bodies are finished, I believe they came out pretty darn good. We'll tie on some basic materials to finish the fly. I like to use 2 colors of marabou, some 64th inch lateral scale, and some rubber legs. I've applied my thread, Now I'll apply the first color of marabou tailing material. I'm not a big fan of long tails. I like to prevent short strikes, so I tend to tie my tail length about the length of the body, beginning of the head, clear back to the hook bend. The first color I'll apply is the cream marabou. The cream marabou will continue the color of the body underneath, so we'll have a cream or a light colored body on the bottom side and an olive body on the top side. I'll measure the next color of marabou, olive, to be the same length as the cream. Next, I'll select out 4 or 5 strands of the crinkle lateral scale. I'll trap the fibers on one side. I'll make it just a little longer than the length of the marabou here in the tail. Apply a few secure thread wraps. Bring this around. And position the lateral scale on the other side, all with one piece of lateral scale. Finally, I'll add the rubber legs. Here I've selected 3 strands. Again, I'll bring that around and trap it underneath the thread and make the rubber legs just a little longer, again, the length of the marabou. And I have some going forward here to mimic the forward legs of a frog. Secure that in place with a few thread wraps, and let's do the other side. Once they're in place, it's easy to take a piece of electrical tape, which won't mar your finish, and that will hold those legs out of the way as you continue to tie off the rest of the fly. Optionally, you could put 2 feathers here and collar that with some webby material, feather material. But I've opted to leave that as a skinny little transition from the marabou to the popper body head. The final step is to apply some clear flexible tying cement right here to secure those thread wraps and make this fly extra durable. Well, that popper came out pretty darn nice. Looks like I have quite a few more to tie, so I'll get busy at that, and I hope you enjoyed this video.